aspiration and widening participation student have become so ubiquitous that in order to explore what they really mean in practice, innovative methods are needed to scratch beneath the surface rhetoric. The challenge of using innovative methods, especially when they are contingent on creativity, is the potential failure of method. Whilst a successful creative task can generate data that is rich, a failed task may not only result in a lack of meaningful data, but also has the potential to alienate the participants in the study. So this paper is going to juxtapose the success and the failure of method. In examining what worked within a study that deployed two creative methods, it will focus on the failure of method to engage participants in the ways anticipated. Uniquely, however, this failure can be contextualised in terms of the successes of the second creative task deployed in the same interview. I will therefore argue, drawing on the feedback from participants, that what factors determine the relative success and failure of each method. It is not only through foregrounding success of creative methods, but through understanding failure that we can better understand the strengths and limits of creative methods. So just to give you a brief overview of the study, it was a two-phase project to look at the similarities and differences between the policy and practice as borne out in pre-entry work to widen access to higher education in English universities. So the first phase was a critical discourse analysis of 10 access agreements as exemplary of institutional policy on widening access. So access agreements are an annually produced document which is submitted to the Office for Fair Access as a regulator. So in these documents, institutions document the measures that they use to encourage access to higher education. So the 10 documents analysed were taken in 5 pairs, so a pre-92 and a post-92 university in 5 different cities covering the whole of England. Whilst there's more categorisations of universities that could be used, I draw on the work of Vicky Bolivar, who used a cluster analysis to look at different types of institution. These were exemplary of the 2 main types. The second phase looked at interviewing practitioners, so looking at what practitioners had to say about some of these themes that were coming out of the discourse analysis. 2 of the key topics that came out of the discourse analysis were the idea of raising aspiration and how participants are targeted. And these are the 2 topics that I'm going to focus on today with the creative methods that I used. So there were 16 practitioners interviewed, 8 from pre-92 institutions and 8 from post-92 institutions. And the interviews lasted between 30 and 75 minutes, containing a number of sections of questions and 2 creative tasks. So the focus of this paper is on the creative tasks. But first, if we just have a look at why creative methods were felt to be appropriate here. So from the analysis of the access agreements in Phase 1, it was clear that the policy rhetoric has become embedded within these documents. Despite bodies of work challenging the notion that disadvantaged students have a poverty of aspirations, so the work of Kim Allen, Sumi Hollingworth, for example, the discourse analysis referred to the idea of raising aspiration in every single one of the 10 access agreements I looked at. The institutions across the board also referred to widening participation students as a shorthand for those groups covered in their agreements. So there's these 2 terms that are being used ubiquitously, but possibly hiding lots of nuance within them. So that's what I wanted to look at with these individual practitioners, was to understand how the views of individual practitioners might match or jar with the use of these terms in policy. So, having worked in this field for several years, I'm aware that the distance often exists between what is said and what is done. So thinking about what Sarah Ahmed talks about, the gap between words and deeds, between what organisations say they will do or what they're committed to doing and what they actually are doing. So this study attempted to delve beyond the rhetorical into nuances of practice. To simply ask a question about targeting would have resulted in regurgitation of an institutional line, and this in fact would tell me no more about what the realities of targeting were than the analysis of the documents alone. Furthermore, to understand what these terms mean to the practitioners, I first needed to understand how they personally viewed some of these terms. So to look at raising aspirations, I first needed to understand what they understood aspiration to look like. So creative methods can be a way to explore common sense terms and allow for the critique of the everyday through enabling discussions in a more engaged manner, so drawing on the work of Gauntless and Holsworth. The use of drawing methods with adults is, however, something that's had limited coverage in literature, and we've heard today from other people in the sessions about how successful or unsuccessful they may have been with adults. As Helen Carr outlines, these methods can offer a way of going beyond categorical or binary thinking to explore issues in a more nuanced way. However, they are prone to challenges when individual participants do not feel confident in their creative abilities and are therefore prone to unpredictable and unforeseeable challenges which are not faced in the same way with a pure interview-based research. Now, whilst the artefacts created were not intended to be the focus of the analysis, the activities were instead, as Gaunt and Holdsworth propose, a starting point for developing thoughts about personal experience. So as I said, there were two methods in the study. The first one I'm going to talk about is the typical student task. This is the sheet that's in the background. So some of the drawing we've talked about today has been giving people a blank sheet of paper. I was slightly concerned that giving adults a blank sheet of paper from the literature might lead to uncomfortableness and them being scared to draw. So I created a kind of framework sheet which had some questions and some prompts and this kind of cut-out man to give them a starting point to work from. The questions around the edge are all based on things that came out of the access agreement analysis. So looking at things like who they were targeting, what these people's lives were like, what these students might like to do after graduation. And the idea was that they would pick a typical student that they might have in their imaginary or they might have worked with and use it to talk through some of the ways in which they target. The inspiration for this task came from a task that I've done many times as a widening participation practitioner with young people, which is normally participated in with enthusiasm and energy. We'll see later on how the practitioners actually approached it. So this visual task was also supplemented by questions to take the specific example to a more general discussion of targeting. The timing of this task was carefully considered. And as we heard this morning, some people have talked about potentially doing drawing tasks before an interview or doing them without the participants present. And I felt that it was really important to do it with the participant present. So it was their instinct gut reaction as what they wanted to put on the sheet. I felt that giving it in advance to the practitioners, when they work in an area where they're so driven by targets and a focus on what the institution wants them to do, might lead to these sheets just ending up being a list of who the ideal target student would be, rather than a typical student they might work with. It was presented in the interview and they were given a couple of minutes to do the task. They were allowed to work in silence, or if they started talking to me, I'd talk with them. The second task that was in the interview was this ladder of aspiration. And this was basically a Lego ladder with 10 figures representing a range of different jobs and careers, from more traditional manual occupations to professions requiring a high level of education or training. Now, whilst Lego has often been used in a metaphorical way within training and development, such as in the model of Lego Serious Play, I wanted to use Lego for its representational quality. I wanted to make it representational to a certain extent, so you'll notice that all the Lego people are yellow. The absence of ethnicity was kind of an important thing in this case. I didn't want to use vignettes of different people, because I thought that might shape how people were talking about different jobs. So taking the Lego was an idea to kind of remove some of the qualities that might make people make snap judgments. However, you'll see the Lego figures are still gendered. One of the things I was very conscious of doing is not putting people in gender stereotypical roles. So you'll see we have a female doctor, we also have a female scientist hidden at the back. So this task was enabled to help the participants consider and explain their perceptions of different careers in hope of generating data on how they conceptualise different jobs in terms of relative success and how they could be compared in terms of their answer of what the idea of raising aspirations meant to them. So I'm going to talk first about the Lego task, because that was the successful one. There was certainly a positive reaction by many to the task. In the post-interview survey that I sent to the participants, many mentioned how enjoyable the task was. And one participant I met a few weeks after the interview spoke of how she did a similar task on paper with her colleagues at work to see what they did. For me, this shows a high level of engagement in the task. In the follow-up survey, one participant also felt the value of the task was that it subverted the typical means of getting information in an interview. Generally, the feedback from using this task was it made the interview really enjoyable. And I've met up with several of these practitioners since doing the interviews who have remembered me as the Lego person. To say everyone was excited by the task, however, would be an overstatement. And as can be seen by Alice's quote on the board, she wasn't sure to start with. That being said, though, all 16 of the participants did engage with the task. So it would be fair to say that we laughed a lot during these interviews. Mel's interview, I don't think we stopped laughing for most of the interview. But early on, she broke the ladder while she was trying to build the model. And she laughed and said, well, you're never going to get anywhere on the aspiration ladder if you fall apart. And I think this was really, really useful because all of the participants I interviewed I'd never met before the interview. And it really quickly broke down the barriers and developed that rapport because we were focused on the task and we engaged in this task and kind of building a common experience through it. And I think that was really, really useful and helped for some of the more honest answers I think I got later on in the interview. As you can see, Beverly also broke the Lego, but she was a bit more worried about breaking the Lego. She was worried about doing it wrong, and that's certainly a theme that's come out in some of the other papers this morning. The physicality of the task was also really important. So, as Gaunt and Halsworth have argued, that encouraging participants to create with an interview often helps them think about things in a different way. And people like Gilliman and Drew have talked about how people might express things they wouldn't normally do with direct questioning. So Andrews was a really good example of this. He lined up all the figures on the table of the 10 different jobs, picked up the investment banker and slammed it straight on the bottom of the ladder. And he was really, really definitive that this was the first job he was going to place on the ladder and the investment banker was the lowest of the low. So which led to obviously a really interesting conversation about how he values investment bankers and how he valued careers in society. Now, I don't think that is something I would have got with any other method, because even if I'd given them a ranking sheet to put them down, I don't think it would have been as clear that it was a definitive move to put the investment banker at the bottom. One of the participants in their post-interview survey also said that it was a really nice change to have to think hard about their reasoning when they were doing the task. So I think this physicality was really, really useful. Framing the task in this way also allowed participants to reflect on their initial assumptions. So in some cases, this involved working and reworking the model until they were happy. This space to think and reflect allowed for discussion, not just of the issues, but how definitive their decision-making was. There's not the time to go into the ways which different participants approach this in terms of their own reflexivity. But some talked through the task, explaining their changes as they went. Some did it in complete silence, and then only talked about it afterwards. Others were very, very kind of talking to themselves, deliberating as they were moving the figures around. There were so many different approaches to how they were reflecting, but this physicality was really, really important for a lot of the participants. The task also allowed for contradictions to be identified. So this came out in explanations when participants often offered about their initial choices. So, for example, Carol, one of the practitioners in the post-92 institution, quite happily put all the figures on the ladder, quite definitively. She was clear about what she was doing. Another post-interview respondent in the survey also said that she didn't believe that professions could be ranked in this way, and hoped she didn't think she was coming across that this was the case. But she found it really useful to reflect on what her beliefs were. So I think this also created a space for some participants to reflect on their thoughts, maybe something which in later parts of the interview showed they had reflected on what they were thinking. So just to compare this task that really, really worked to one that didn't. So despite doing this as a pilot, and in the pilot getting people to draw on these figures, in the main data collection phase, not a single participant drew on the outline of the person. So they were given a specific instruction at the end that they could draw, they could write, they could talk through the sheet. So I gave lots of ways of kind of approaching the task. There was a whole selection of materials. There were colour pens, pencils, colouring pencils and biros. And all of the participants went for writing materials rather than drawing materials. Some we've heard earlier about using different colours to signify different things. That didn't happen in any of these. They all went straight for either the blue or the black pen. However, whilst the methodology of drawing failed, the data and discussions coming from this as a talking tool were really invaluable. And I think that was one thing I would take away from this, is having those get-out-of-jail-free cards kind of thing really did help ensure the success of the method. So, I was mindful of the fact that I didn't want to make the participants uncomfortable, and hence why I offered the get-out-jail-free cards. This extract from Hannah's interview shows a common approach, diverting from drawing tools away to the safety of a biro. Additionally, the text elements on the sheet seemed to make some participants feel like it was a structured questionnaire, as opposed to a worksheet. So in hindsight, maybe removing these from the sheet might have encouraged more drawing. However, given the post-interview feedback, I think there really would have been discomfort with drawing, because out of 7 questionnaires I got back, about 5 of them said they weren't confident with drawing, that's why they didn't draw, because they don't like to draw. So I think that's possibly something to reflect on. So lessons to take forward. Given that one visual method was engaged with and one was abandoned for an alternative writing option, I think there's something to be said for a creative task being within the realms of something a participant feels that they can achieve. Drawing seems to be one step too far for most of the participants in the study, and they quickly took this get-out-of-jail-free card. Now, one route to this might be the space between drawing methods and Legos, and something like the plasticine Jesse's talked about and Nicola Ingram's also worked with. The Lego task was clearly more well engaged with, and even those who didn't engage with the task as much were stimulated by the visual task to talk about the issues I wanted to explore. It can also be seen how visual tasks can help participants to challenge their own taken for granted ideas. However, it's important to understand what the visual was for. In some research, it's the artefacts that are there to be analysed, but here it was as a talking tool to generate that discussion. And I think there needs to be an adaptability available in approaches to enable all participants to access creative methods successfully. Certainly, even with the Lego task, participants expressed a worry of getting it wrong. So there needs to be a sense of shared understanding that the creative method is part of the process and not adjudged